Hey everybody, let's talk a little more about how Darwin developed his theory of natural selection as the mechanism, the driving force behind evolutionary changes in living things. And in the previous video, touched on Lamarck, another biologist and another scientist who thought that plants and animals had changed over the history of the earth. And Lamarck had an interesting idea, and it was certainly a reasonable sounding explanation given what we understood about inheritance and how traits are passed on at the time. And just to summarize, Lamarck thought that if animals used or didn't use some of their body parts, they might develop or might diminish over the course of the animal's life. And that development or diminishment would be passed on to offspring. So, the fiddler crab is a species of crab that has one giant claw and one small claw. And so, a Lamarckian evolutionary biologist might say that, well, the fiddler crab ancestors would use that one claw to ward off predators and to try to show off for potential mates. And over time, by using that claw to defend itself and to try to attract mates, it gets bigger and bigger. And as it grew in an animal's lifetime, that animal was able to pass on the larger claw to its offspring. And we now know that Lamarck was wrong, but understandably so because he didn't understand the mechanisms for inheritance. And we now know that if an animal uses a particular structure in its body during its lifetime, that doesn't usually mean that it's going to change the genes. We do have a more nuanced view of that now because there are ways that a person's genetic expression can change during its lifetime, but it's still mostly down to the A's, T's, G's, and C's in our chromosomes, in our DNA molecules. But again, Darwin thought that Lamarck had a reasonable idea. Lots of other people did too. And he thought that it contributed to evolution, but he didn't think it was the most important. Malthus, he was an economist and a social scientist who proposed a theory for why human populations didn't grow out of control, because he saw that there was the potential for human populations to expand exponentially and to eventually become so big that the earth wouldn't be able to supply all those folks with places to live and food to eat and so forth. And the growth was limited, the population growth was limited because resources were limited. And other things would happen, like a disease outbreak, a pandemic, let's say, or war, something like that, where a bunch of people would die in a short period of time. That influenced Darwin mostly for the idea that populations in nature, in ecosystems, tended to also remain relatively stable with fluctuations seasonally and cyclically. And so Darwin thought a similar thing must be happening over the long term with living things, that resources were limited, and that would be what creates some of the competition in the survival of the fittest in natural selection. So we mentioned a little bit that Darwin was shy about confessing this murder, publishing his ideas, but eventually he was pushed to do so when a fellow naturalist sent him a short essay describing his ideas about evolution and natural selection. And again, it was shown in the video that Darwin responded to this by basically saying he's totally summarized my work, and he had no idea, obviously, because none of that work was published, and because Wallace was in Malaysia at the time, or Indonesia, I think. Anyway, receiving Wallace's paper spurred Darwin into action. And so he and colleagues who knew about Darwin's idea presented Wallace's paper along with a sketch of Darwin's ideas simultaneously to give Wallace equal credit. And then Darwin put the finishing touches on his manuscript and published his book a year later on the origin of species by means of natural selection. Darwin's book is thoroughly readable. It is not difficult to understand, and again, I've mentioned that that's unusual for groundbreaking, unifying theories in science. That they're relatively simple. So don't feel like I'm assigning you to read the whole book, but I think it's of interest to check it out and to at least browse through parts of it and see what you think. So, what evidence did Darwin present in his book? One of the strongest pieces of evidence Darwin presented was the correlation between what is termed by Darwin artificial selection and the natural selection that he believed takes place in natural ecosystems. Artificial selection is also called selective breeding, and this is what humans have done with domesticated species of plants and animals for several thousand years now. And we have made dramatic changes to those species by choosing which of the individuals will be the parents of the next generation. So, which corn plants produced the best corn? Well, we want to choose those as the parent plants for next year's crop. And dogs have been hanging around with people for 10,000 years or so. And we have chosen the dogs who get along with us the best and who can serve a particular purpose. And so Darwin was a pigeon fancier, and he knew about all these crazy breeds of pigeons. And so apart from the obvious and familiar example of dogs, I've pointed out a couple of other examples from domesticated species where in the plant example, we have a native wild-type brassica plant. The plants we did for our genetics experiments were also brassica. That's like a wild mustard plant. And those plants were chosen for certain parts of the plant that could be used as food. And now we have all of these different varieties of this ancestral plant that look very, very different. Cabbage and kale and broccoli and cauliflower. But they are all the same species originally. All the breeds of pigeons, and there are some wild-looking birds, all are descended from the wild rock pigeons. So by choosing which individuals would mate and therefore produce the next generation of offspring, humans have selected and amplified these traits that we were interested in, curious about, that we desired for the domestic animals that we use in our life. So, if humans in a few hundred or a few thousand years could create all of these dramatic changes in species of plants and animals, what might the struggle for existence and natural selection be able to do in the wild for plants and animals, and fungi and bacteria? So this struggle for existence, we talked about Malthus and this idea that there were limited resources for plants and animals, and so there would be some competition for those limited resources. And Darwin suggested that this could be the selecting mechanism rather than humans choosing which individuals breed, which individuals reproduce, the environment by sort of deciding which animals and plants are best suited for survival in their current environment. Which of those would get to produce the next generation? And that's the way the selection would take place. Darwin talked about an animal's fitness. And so that idea, survival of the fittest, is coming from this notion that given the variation that can exist in a species, certain individuals will have traits that make it better able to survive and reproduce. And those individuals that have lots of those traits are more likely to survive and be fit, have a better fitness in their environment. And artificial selection helped Darwin name his mechanism, which was natural selection. He said instead of humans being the deciding factor, it was the conditions in the environment that was selecting which traits would help an animal or plant's fitness and give it a better chance for surviving. Over time, natural selection acting on a population will do what is inevitable. It will make traits that help an organism survive and reproduce. It will make those traits become more common in a population. Those genes that determine those traits will become more common. And it will make the traits and the genes that are behind those physical traits, those phenotypes, it will make the traits that do not help an animal survive and reproduce become less common in a population. And so this was descent with modification. This was this inheritance year after year after year in a population of traits that help survival, that help an organism or a group of organisms be adapted to their environment, and the weeding out of genes and traits that did not help those organisms adapt and survive in their environment. So that was this idea of descent with modification, this gradual change generation after generation due to the differential survival of individuals in a population. Next time, we'll go on to talk about the big areas of evidence that Darwin presented in his book as support for the idea that evolution was a fact in nature.